Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it is the second part of my conversation with the historian Robert Saunders in our occasional series when we look at important anniversaries, and we are talking on the 100th anniversary of Britain's 1926 general strike. Today, we explore how the strike ended, who won, who lost, and also how the winners turned into losers. But we also look at the legacy of the general strike in the miners' disputes of the 1970s and the 1980s. And we ask, when, where, how might the idea of a general strike still have teeth today? Robert, I was very struck by something you said in the previous episode, that essentially for the TUC, the money was going to run out after 2 weeks. A strike on this scale was extraordinarily expensive. It makes one think it was almost a lost cause from the start. In those terms, given in the end this was a contest between the union movement and the government, not the mine owners at this point, this is the government now. The government's resources would outlast 2 weeks. The union movement was always facing a very tight schedule, and the clock was ticking from day one. Is it just hindsight that makes one feel this cause was lost from the beginning?
I think that view was quite widely shared among the TUC leadership, actually, at the time. When the meeting is held formally to call the strike, a lot of the reports on it stress there's almost a kind of funereal atmosphere. There's a sense of kind of martyrs marching towards the gunfire, and this is a generation that knows what marching to the gunfire looks like. Ramsay MacDonald tells the Daily Herald, "I don't like general strikes. I don't like it. Honestly, I don't like it. But honestly, what can be done?" So right from the start, the unions actually, they feel this kind of ethical commitment to stand by the miners. But the goal is always to find an off-ramp. The goal is to return to negotiations. Whereas the government, on the other hand, knows that to some extent, it simply has to outlast the TUC. It knows its financial position is very difficult. It's increasing the legal pressure on the TUC. And to some extent, it just has to survive long enough for the strike to break down.
I suggested last time that Baldwin's government might have, if not welcomed the opportunity of the strike, been more than simply prepared for it. They understood the stakes, and if this thing was coming, they were determined to win it. They almost certainly were going to be able to outlast their opponents. And yet, as you also suggested last time, it was a very precarious moment for the government. The descriptions of Stanley Baldwin during the strike are of a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The strain, his nerves, as they would have put it at the time, his nerves were really close to breaking point. Churchill, as always, relished it. One is reminded of the stories in 1914 as war was declared and the cabinet was generally in a somewhat bleak frame of mind, but Churchill looked like he'd just been told that the summer holidays had arrived early. And the general strike, it was galvanizing for men like him. But for a politician like Baldwin, and we haven't said much about Baldwin, I think we should say a bit more. Though the cards were stacked in his favor, the deck was stacked in his favor, he did think that at various points in those 9 days, there was a real risk of disaster. Was it just his nerves? I mean, it was a stressful time. Or are there scenarios in which this thing could have gone wrong in those 9 days, badly wrong for the government?
I think we shouldn't underestimate the level of strain under which almost everybody is operating in this period. In the 3 to 4 days before the strike begins, there are almost continuous negotiations going on through the day and night. You have a group of people who are extraordinarily sleep deprived and who have an incredible sense of what is at stake here. It is very hard to look around Europe in the 1920s and not have a sense that societies are fragile, that constitutions are precarious, and that democracy itself is a great experiment which could fail. You are looking around Europe and you are seeing the failure of parliamentary democracies in all sorts of different contexts. And I think that weighs particularly heavily on Stanley Baldwin, because Baldwin's whole brand is that he is the teacher of an emergent democracy. We have to remember it's only since 1918 that Britain has had universal adult suffrage. It's only since 1918 that 8 million women have been able to vote. And the most consistent theme of Baldwin's rhetoric throughout the 1920s is that we are engaged in a great experiment, that democracies have great capacities for good, but they also have extraordinary capacity to collapse. It is a political generation that is still largely trained in the classics. It has studied the fall of democracies in the ancient world. And so, even if the government is confident that it can probably beat this strike, there is a sense that much of its work might be undone, that there might be lasting damage here. They know that there are people swirling around, not just the kind of communists that they imagine under every bed, but also movements like the British fascisti that really want to see a sharpening of class tensions, that regard the general strike as a moment at which Labour and the Constitution are going to start fighting, from which they can profit. So even if you think you can win the strike, the possibility for things to go wrong is very high.
Was there a fear that Baldwin's version of conservatism might be outflanked on the right? As you say, the classic view of this is that this is a contest between the government or capital or the establishment and the forces on the left. It's also true that we should remember Mussolini started out as a syndicalist. Fascism, to call this left and right, to think of fascism as right and communism as left doesn't quite make sense yet in this period. But nonetheless, then as now, there is a view within the Conservative Party that the single most important thing for its electoral success is not to be outflanked on the right. Was there a fear for Baldwin, who was broadly speaking within Conservative politics a centrist figure, that he might lose control of the party to, let's call them, more robust forces of law and order?
Probably Baldwin's most famous speech is one that he gives in 1925, when he calls in the House of Commons, "Give peace in our time, O Lord." And he gives that speech on the subject of trade union regulation. He's actually asking his own backbenchers not to vote for a measure that will make it more difficult for trade unions to fund the Labour Party. So Baldwin is aware that much of his party believes that he is soft on trade unionism, that he is soft on the threat of socialism, and would quite like to push him aside for somebody who really does relish the fight. Not necessarily Winston Churchill, because there are so many doubts about his judgment, but there are others in the party that want to take a much more robust approach. When Conservatives call Churchill Mussolini Major and Joynson Hicks Mussolini Minor, that is usually a joke, but it's not always a joke. And of course, this is a period in which many people in British politics really do admire what Mussolini is doing in Italy. So Baldwin knows that the costs of losing the strike, or the costs of being seen to be soft on the strike, are also potentially costs for his own party and for his own vision of conservatism. This is a man who is very suspicious of figures like Lloyd George, dynamic leaders, somebody who knows that the Conservative Party had come out of a long electoral wilderness in the period before the 1920s, who has seen that the party can win a majority in 1922 and then lose in 1923, and then win again in 1924, but then lose by elections. There is something precarious about the vision of conservatism for which he stands. And I think that is also why there are so many accounts of him bursting into tears during the crisis, or finding himself unable to speak because of the weight of emotion that is within him.
What in the end decided the TUC to call it off? So what actually precipitated the end of the strike? The government had, in its own mind at least, established a legal opinion that the strike was illegal, which raised the stakes enormously for the union movement because the liabilities then were much greater. As you said, both personally and collectively, it might be that everyone involved in the strike was criminally liable for its consequences. But what finally broke the unions on day 9?
So, as we've discussed, the unions had been looking for a return to negotiations all the way through. That is, for them, the goal of the strike. They're given an off-ramp by a man called Sir Herbert Samuel. Samuel is one of many respected liberals who is floating around in this. It's always a good idea for the government to put a liberal in charge of negotiations because they can be seen as standing between the Conservative Party and the Labour movement. Samuel had led the Royal Commission of 1925. He's actually out in Italy studying his books in 1926, but he returns to Britain to try to negotiate a settlement. And he comes up with a package of proposals which involve continuing the government subsidy for a little bit longer, removing for the time being the lockout notices, and restoring negotiations around the principles of the report that he had produced the previous year. Now, what he can't do, of course, is commit the government to accept these proposals. The TUC falls upon them like a kind of long-lost lover. It sees this as its opportunity to end the strike on the terms that it said that it was actually fighting for. And it is perhaps willfully naive in believing that Samuel can speak for the government's acceptance of those proposals. There are reasons why they're naive. Samuel certainly lets it be understood that he has contacts in government. He actually writes his key proposals on a sheet of notepaper, which has number 10 Downing Street at the top. He's writing on Downing Street stationery, so it's not crazy that the TUC believes that this is a possibility. But they think that they are ending the strike on the basis of reopening negotiations. They think they found an honourable way out of the strike and are deeply shocked when the government publicises this as an unconditional surrender.
The other people who couldn't be committed by Samuel, and maybe also couldn't be committed by the government, were the mine owners. One of the complicating factors here is that the general strike was clearly a contest between government and the TUC, but underneath it was a dispute between the mining union and the mine owners who had instituted the lockout, the mine owners who would reinstate the lockout without a government subsidy, so the government were involved in that sense. But in a way, the people who clearly had the most to lose at the end of the strike were the miners, not least because solidarity had failed. In a sense, not just the government, but the mine owners had called the union movement's bluff. This started as a dispute where the mine owners were willing to shut their mines and lock out the miners, in theory for as long as it took. And it was only a government subsidy that kept the mines going. Once the strike has failed, there is almost nothing that is going to bring the mine owners back to the negotiating table in a weaker position than they started, which means, in a way, the people who had the most to lose were the miners themselves.
Yes, Samuel cannot commit the mine owners, and indeed the TUC cannot commit the miners, which is why we have this rather curious outcome of an end to the general strike, while the miners' strike that precipitated it continues all the way through until November. And at that point, the miners are entirely beaten, and the effects of that are absolutely desperate. They do return on much lower wages. There is a significant loss of mining employment. Working hours are extended, and as had been predicted, that increases the number of mining disasters, accidents, and deaths in the years that follow. It also sees quite large numbers of trade union activists in the Miners' Federation blacklisted. So, for example, Dennis Skinner's father is a miner in 1926 who is blacklisted and finds it very difficult to work again. And the Miners' Federation loses something like a third of its total membership. It's a catastrophe for the mining industry, catastrophe for the coal miners, and a catastrophe for the Miners' Federation. I think the other consequence of the way that the strike plays out is that it leaves a kind of two-way sense of betrayal. The Miners' Federation feel deeply betrayed by the TUC, that the TUC have snatched at an opportunity to end the strike and have left them unprotected, and that once again the purported solidarity across the union movement has been broken. But the TUC actually also feels betrayed by the miners, because they feel that they have made extraordinary sacrifices. The National Union of Railwaymen, the Transport and General Workers Union, have drained their resources. There are lots of workers going back to work at the end of the strike who are going to be going back on lower pay and worse conditions. And that the miners have, in a sense, refused to recognise that sacrifice and refused to recognise it's not only their interests that are at stake in the strike. They have actually only paid regard to the interests of the mining industry and not to the wider union movement. So both sides actually have this kind of well of bitterness from which they're drinking in the years after the strike.
And it should be said, the underlying thing that continued when the general strike was over, was the lockout. It wasn't that the miners carried on striking. It is that the mine owners locked them out and, I don't think it's putting it too strongly, effectively starved them back to work. I mean, to be locked out in this period in which there is minimal welfare support is to run the very real risk of not being able to feed your families. And the miners were broken by the end of the year, by the lockout, which also makes one feel, I mean, betrayal seems like a strong word for the rest of the union movement to feel in relation to the miners. What were the miners meant to do? Was the conclusion that actually the miners were just going to have to suck up the fact that coal had become unprofitable. The mine owners were going to need to either extend hours or cut pay or both. I mean, the terms that the miners were being offered and the conditions on which they were being offered them, we're going to lock you out until you accept them. Given that there was this agreement between the major unions that they would support each other in just this kind of dispute, I completely get why the railwaymen, the Transport and General Workers Union might feel that didn't go well, we're worse off than we were before. But what were the miners meant to do?
Well, it may well be an unfair charge. I think what many of the TUC leaders felt was that some part of the eventual solution to the mining problem was going to involve wage reductions. The key was to make sure, first of all, that that happened as part of a wider package of reforms, so that not all of the pain is falling on mine workers, that you have things like national minimums that protect those who are working in the least productive pits. And secondly, that it isn't simply a precondition to other negotiations. A lot of this argument is actually about sequencing. Do you accept that mining wages will be cut and then negotiate? No trade union is really going to accept that. Or do you say everything has to be on the table, including nationalisation, including the nationalisation of royalties, including reorganisation of pits, and as part of that discussion, we can discuss some kind of wage reduction? And the TUC feel that if you can get to a point in which the Miners' Federation accepts the Samuel report and says we are willing to have a negotiation that involves cutting wages as part of it, then the moral pressure on government and on the mine owners is much greater, especially given that this is essentially about accepting a report that the government commissioned the previous year. As long as the miners won't accept it, then it's easy for government and the owners not to do so either.
We're going to talk about later coal disputes and their echoes of what happened in 1926. But in 1926, given the kind of rhetoric that was to emerge later in the century, was there any sense that one of the lessons of this strike was that the coal industry wasn't merely very inefficient in the way that it was organized? It was living on borrowed time, that the way in which Britain's energy, resources, and indeed economy had been built around coal was not going to be sustainable in the long term. Cheaper imports were a fact of life. The British coal industry would not be able to support 1 million people at a wage on which those 1 million people and their families could live. That actually, what was coming out of this was not simply pay cuts, longer working hours, but an industry that was going to have to be streamlined? Or are we still a long way from that version of the argument?
I think that is essentially a counsel of despair. I think we're still operating in a period in which it is assumed that Britain, if it is going to remain a great power and a great industrial power, is going to have a substantial and successful coal industry. So the question for everybody is, how do you make that possible? The idea that you simply run down the industry is not one that government or the TUC or the Miners' Federation really want to countenance. The question is, do you do that by making, if you like, employment conditions more competitive? Do you do that by pushing down wages? Or is there going to have to be something more radical here, something that involves government reorganising the industry, amalgamating pits, potentially taking it into public ownership? And so a kind of healing moment in terms of the memory of the general strike is when the Attlee government takes power after 1945, and one of the first things it is able to do is to bring the mining industry into public ownership. And Ernest Bevin is clearly enormously proud of that. And, as somebody who had been one of the leaders who had kind of left the miners behind in 1926, there is a sense of a kind of historical debt being paid here.
Bevin was one of the people who was directly accused of betrayal by the people who thought the TUC had sold out the miners. What wider lessons do you think the union movement took from the strike? Was the conclusion never again? In a sense, the general strike is no longer a weapon in our arsenal. We've tried it. We've seen how it goes. it doesn't work. It cannot work for us. And if that is true, that the general strike, the ultimate weapon, is actually a damp squib, we can't deploy it. Did that then force a reevaluation of the broader strategy of trade union politics, indeed of labour politics in this period, that negotiation was inevitable, solidaristic strikes ultimately bleed the union movement more than they achieve results, that actually we're going to have to move into a more pragmatic era of labour relations? Was the lesson learned, we tried, that didn't work, we're going to have to do it differently from now on?
Yeah, I think there's perhaps a sense of confirming what most union leaders had already believed, that the general strike was not going to be an effective tool, and that the priority had to be the parliamentary route to socialism. As we discussed earlier, this has never really been a revolutionary trade union movement. It's a trade union movement that has built its success and built its parliamentary party within the existing constitution. It has won the 1906 Trade Disputes Act under a pre-democratic constitution. Even the 1927 Act that follows the strike, that does trim some of the rights of trade unions, actually doesn't go nearly as far as many in the union movement believe that it will do. So there is a kind of confirmatory effect of the strike. And it strengthens, I think, those within the TUC who see that as the primary route to success.
Was it then a Pyrrhic victory for Baldwin and the Conservatives? One of the fascinating facts of British politics in this period is presumably, I'm guessing, in the summer of 1926, Baldwin looked like he was riding high. He had seen off this strike, he'd had his tearful moments, but he'd come out the other side, and he'd come out as a somewhat healing figure. His final addresses on the BBC were definitely not those of a man who was crowing victory, but of a man who wanted to restore his role as the tutor and the healer of the nation. Within a year, he was able to pass legislation, which, among other things, did somewhat give the lie to the idea that the strike had been illegal, because if it had been illegal, there would have been no need to pass legislation saying that if you do this again, it will be illegal. Among the things that were outlawed in the 27 legislation was solidaristic strikes of this kind. And in 1929, he lost the general election, and Ramsay MacDonald, for whom the strike had been an extraordinarily difficult period, you quoted him saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, oh my God, we have to do this. 3 years later, he's back in Downing Street. How did that happen? I mean, it feels like a pretty dramatic turnaround, and that something about the outcome of the strike was illusory, and some of the reckoning as to who won and who lost would look very different just within 2 or 3 years of the outcome of a strike, which looked like its result had been decisive. I mean, it really did look like you could say, these people won, these people lost, and the people who lost are going to have a long, hard road back. Well, no.
Yes, sometimes there is nothing so dangerous in politics as an overwhelming victory. On the day that the TUC comes to number 10 and declares that the strike is over, Baldwin then goes out and gets in a car to drive to the House of Commons. And he actually can't move initially because the car is just surrounded by crowds cheering and waving their hats and celebrating the end of the strike. But only 3 weeks later, Labour flips a by-election. It wins, I think, North Hammersmith from the Conservatives. And that's perhaps the first sign that actually the politics of this aren't going to play out quite in the way that many people have predicted. As you've said, the next general election doesn't just bring Labour back into government, it makes Labour for the first time the largest party in the House of Commons. So it looks like in electoral terms the forward march of Labour is still going. And I think perhaps there are two elements here which are harmful to the Conservative Party. The first is that Baldwin is unable to resist pressure from his backbenchers to pass a new Trade Disputes Act, which, among other things, makes it more difficult for trade unions to fund the Labour Party. It changes the political levy from being something you opt out of to something that you actively opt into, and the effect of that is a big hit to the Labour Party's finances. Now, Baldwin's whole brand is that he, in a sense, stands above party, that he is a national leader, that he is a conciliator who wants to bring people together. So a moment to which he is seen to be acting in a nakedly partisan fashion, using the general strike to punish his political opponents, I think actually does quite serious harm to Baldwin's image in the country. The other problem is that there can be a danger for a political movement in slaying its dragons. So much of conservative propaganda in the first half of the 1920s has been about the danger of socialism and how only the Conservative Party can protect you from this dangerous movement. Well, in a sense, the danger has been tried and the danger has passed after 1926. It's possible to feel sympathetic to the trade union movement and the miners once they have been safely beaten. So it's actually more difficult for the Conservative Party to press either of the electoral buttons that have been really valuable to them before 26. One, Baldwin the conciliator, the other, the Conservatives as the scourge of socialism. So they end up running this rather shapeless campaign instead, in which the slogan famously is safety first. Well, if that's the best that you can say to the country after 5 years in government, it's not an electrifying reason for people to come out and vote for you.
Your description of Baldwin going to the House of Commons surrounded by cheering crowds throwing their hats into the air, it inevitably brings to mind Chamberlain after Munich in 1938, another victory that evaporated almost as soon as it had been achieved. And in both cases, I think it's probably fair to say that what was motivating the emotions of the crowds was relief. It wasn't an endorsement of something that had been decided. It wasn't, in a way, a positive political emotion. That kind of euphoria is often an expression of thank God that wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be. And that is a very difficult political emotion to bottle and take forward because it dissipates quite quickly. And certainly it feels like in 1926 that relief was the overriding emotion. It could have gone very badly wrong on both sides. The disruption was serious and people lost their lives, mainly in accidents, it should be said, but the accidents were partly caused by the incompetence of the volunteers who came to step in for people who knew how to operate the machinery. And one of the lessons of the strike was being a worker is not as easy as it looks. It's not just a jolly jaunt driving a bus or a tram. These are big, dangerous machines. And the people who operate them, they have our lives in their hands. But that sense of emotion, that is particularly, it seems to me, the kind of political victory that you have to be very wary of assuming it means that a pattern has been set for the future. And actually, if the emotion is relief, it's not that hard then for the people who ostensibly lost to regroup, because people will give them a fresh look. It wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be. Maybe there are other options on the table.
I think in lots of ways, the big political losers, actually, from the general strike are the various fascist parties. The British fascisti in particular really does think that the general strike is going to be their moment, that this brings into collision a dangerous revolutionary socialist movement waging war upon the community. It will show the inadequacy of a soft conservative government, and people will turn instead to fascism to defend them. In fact, the British fascisti essentially break up in the years after the general strike because the revolutionary movement hasn't come. The Conservative Party seems to be quite capable of handling a trade union movement. The trade union movement itself appears more an object of pity than of fear. So this constant story that's told about how not a shot is fired, that the British people demonstrate their loyalty, and to some extent that that's true both of strikers and of volunteers, is one that is intensely unhelpful to British fascism. So we don't talk about fascism in the 1920s precisely because it's so weak, but I think it is worth thinking about the moments that help us to understand why that is the case.
Unhelpful for fascism and helpful for the Labour Party? Would you say, broadly speaking, actually the general strike is the moment where that dilemma that I sketched out at the beginning for the Labour Party as the political wing of the trade union movement, but also with aspirations to be a party of government? MacDonald, during the strike, he had played his cards pretty close to his chest. And I'm going to talk about analogies with other Labour leaders in other strike situations in a moment. But he had, in some ways, he had hedged his bets. I mean, he certainly hadn't committed himself in a way that meant when the strike ended, he was obviously one of the people who had gambled and lost. The rise of the British Labour Party, though the 30s were going to be very difficult for them, but the rise of the British Labour Party as the rival party of government, could you date it from actually the general strike as the moment where this course is set?
I mean, I'd perhaps approach it slightly differently, which is that the political landscape that Stanley Baldwin wants to set is one in which the Conservative Party is the party of the nation. It is a cross-class party, a cross-denominational party, which is dedicated towards the idea of unity. And ironically, of course, that means casting the Labour Party as the party that challenges unity, that Labour is not a national party. Labour is simply a sect. Labour is, in some sense, politically illegitimate. So the task for the Labour Party is actually to challenge Baldwin for that crown. Say, actually, no, we are a constitutional party too. We are also a party of the people. And it is the Conservative Party that stands, in fact, for sectarian private interests. And the aftermath of the strike, I think, is more helpful to Labour than the Conservatives in that kind of rhetorical battle. First, because of the Trade Disputes Act that we've talked about, but also actually because of the sense of a sort of dirty trick that was played over the Samuel report. The sense that actually the TUC believed they were reopening negotiations. They believed they had found an opportunity to talk again with the mine owners and rebuild the mining industry on a consensual basis, and that is ripped away from them. And that it becomes known that Ramsay MacDonald had wanted to broadcast on the BBC and had been denied the opportunity to do so. The text of his broadcast is published, and it is remarkably conciliatory. It is very much a call for peace. It's not a call for people to man the barricades and bring the economy to a standstill.
It's more like the Archbishop of Canterbury's address than Lenin.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes it easier to kind of tell the story that, in fact, Labour itself is a kind of conciliatory force that has been obstructed by kind of punitive financial interests in the Conservative Party.
So I want to talk now about the afterlife of the idea of a general strike, but also of these kinds of industrial disputes, particularly the ones that centre on coal, because there is a rerun of this story. In fact, maybe there are two reruns of it, or maybe the two reruns together are a rerun in the 1970s and 1980s. As you've suggested, there is a cathartic moment, 45-46. A Labour government is elected for the first time, not just the biggest in Parliament, but with a majority, and not just a majority, but an enormous majority. The 1945 election was transformative, and Labour are unequivocally now a party of national government. And Labour in 1945 ran a very national campaign. The coal industry was nationalised. Nationalisation was understood as the sort of thing that a party of national government might do. And British politics entered a period of a couple of decades in which there was, broadly speaking, consensus about industrial relations, though there were many strikes. But the stakes of these strikes did not reach the heights of the 1920s and 1930s. And the Conservative Party had been brought into line with Labour's vision of how a national economy might be managed. But in the 1970s and the 1980s, coal returned as a flashpoint in not just industrial politics, but British national politics. Coal created very high stakes strikes and events for Conservative governments, Edward Heath's in the early 1970s and then Margaret Thatcher's in the middle of the 1980s. In those disputes, I said that one of the lessons of 1926 was never again. But also one of the lessons of 1926 was there had been betrayals, and this noble strike in a noble cause had failed because various people had let down the people who had virtue and right on their side. In the 70s and in the 80s, did the idea of a general strike come back? Was there a sense that actually, in order to save the coal industry, solidaristic trade union action was going to be necessary? And if so, if that idea did come back, how close do you think it ever got to becoming a reality again?
Well, we should remember that memories of the general strike are still very raw and often actually quite personal in the 1970s. In 1976, the TUC marks the 50th anniversary of the general strike. Somebody like Roy Jenkins, who we might not think of as a radical figure on the left, his father had been arrested and imprisoned as a result of the general strike. So people remember this quite vigorously, and they have a sense, in some ways, similar conditions are returning. You're dealing once again with an extremely difficult economic condition, and you're engaging with those problems again of, are there certain industries that are so important to the country that they cannot simply be left to the logic of capitalism? They cannot simply close at the whim of the market. And if they can't, then what is your alternative instead? I think in some ways what's missing in the 1970s and 1980s compared to the 20s is actually the central role of the TUC. A remarkable feature of the general strike is the extent to which it is run and directed by the TUC. and the extent to which workers around the country are following instructions that are coming down from Eccleston Square. Whereas what we see in the strikes of the 1970s, leaving aside for a moment the coal strikes, but thinking about things like the Winter of Discontent, is actually something much more bottom-up, in which the trade union leadership actually is losing control of what's happening at the grassroots. And that, of course, itself partly feeds on the idea that your leaders will always betray you, that actually real democracy rests in the base among ordinary workers, and that the generation of trade union leaders you have now, like the trade union leaders you have in the 1920s, must be the instruments of the movement and not its directors.
In the coal disputes of the early 1970s, when Ted Heath was the Conservative Prime Minister, I don't know if it's fair to say that Ted Heath might have thought of himself as a somewhat Baldwin-like figure. I don't know if that's true, but certainly when he was elected, he thought that he was going to be leading a government which spoke for and on behalf of the nation, and he was facing a sectarian, radicalized mining union, but he backed down. Did he back down because, in some part of his mind, do you think, he feared that he didn't lead a government or have the resources to face down an organized, coordinated, solidaristic labour movement, or was it something else? Why did he buckle in the face of a mining strike?
I suspect it's partly that there is a perhaps greater ruthlessness around the strikes in 72 and 74 than there had been in 26. Something we talked about a little bit in the previous episode is the extent to which the TUC fights with one hand behind its back, in which the strength of the trade union movement lies in its ability to obstruct and disrupt essential services, whereas the strength of government lies in its ability to maintain and continue them. And the TUC is quite reluctant actually to do that, partly because it's so determined to demonstrate its own constitutionality and respectability. In 1926, whereas in the early 1970s, you are seeing famously the lights going out, the 3-day working week in industry, people in factories wrapped in duvets, typing by candlelight. The sense of the damage that is being done is so visceral and so severe. And of course, you still have a very active media that is constantly projecting and communicating this to the public. The other point, of course, I suppose as well, is that although coal mining is a less important part of the economy in the 1970s than it was in the 1920s, it's happening in the context of an international energy crisis, which amplifies its strength. Whereas the option is open to you in 1926 of French and German coal. There are other ways, actually, in which you can power your economy in a way that is just harder to do in the 1970s.
So is it, in fact, one of the ironic consequences of the extraordinary sensitivity in 1926 to the charge that this is unconstitutional because it is actually disrupting the very fabric of the British way of life, that in the early 1970s, something closer to what is needed to win a strike of this kind, which is more or less to make the country aware that it is at the mercy of these forces, the people who are withdrawing their labour, that actually everyday life is at risk. Even though it wasn't in the early 1970s organised as a general strike, as a coordinated trade union position, it wasn't as a result of an agreement between all the major unions that they would come out in support of each other. It's simply that it was easier in the 1970s to disrupt, which was the thing that in 1926 the TUC had been so fearful of seeming to be driving as its primary purpose. So actually what Heath faced was more dangerous. In a way, it was more like a general strike than what Baldwin faced.
Well, there's a long history in the labour movement of believing that the core problem is betrayal by leaders, and leaders who are too absorbed in the political establishment actually to use their industrial muscle as they should. So one reading of 1926 is to look back and say the problem here is that Jimmy Thomas, the railwaymen's leader, is sitting around in London clubs with Lord Wimborne and with various members of the cabinet and is having dinner with Lord Birkenhead. The problem is that Ramsay MacDonald loves his parties. He's spending a lot of time in the aristocratic embrace. And out of this comes, even if it's not a deliberate treachery, an extravagant faith in British institutions, a belief that gentlemen will do the right thing, that Baldwin will act on the Samuel proposals, a belief that other trade unions will stand by you and support you, and people will be reasonable. And a lesson that somebody like Arthur Scargill draws from 26, and he quotes A.J. Cook quite regularly throughout those strikes, is that, in a sense, it is a case of ourselves alone. That we actually have to fight this without thinking that the lawyers are going to help us, without thinking that the politicians are going to help us, perhaps without even thinking that other unions are going to help us. We do this ourselves, and we maximise our power.
The strike in 1984, 1985, in some respects, it does seem to parallel the events of 1925, 1926, in the sense that there was a feeling both in government and on the side of the mining union that a showdown was coming. Margaret Thatcher wanted to be very clear that when it came, she was prepared for it. So as Baldwin in 25, she in 1982 shied away from the showdown. She wanted it to happen on her terms. In 1984, her government was much better prepared. It had won another election, which helps. But also coal had been stockpiled. It wasn't quite a case of having the special constables ready. But there was a feeling that forces had to be marshalled for the showdown when it came. The Labour leader in 1984-85, Neil Kinnock, was in a difficult position, as Ramsay MacDonald was in 1925-26. There were calls for a general strike in support of the miners in 1984-85. I think Tony Benn, among others, said, what's the point of a union movement if we don't come out in support of a mining industry which is facing an existential threat? I mean, it feels like a parallel story. Is that an illusion, actually? You can sort of track events that map onto the events in 25-26. And of course, the result was the same as well. The government did outlast the miners. And the government, which, to a greater extent, I think, than in 1926, tried to say, this is not our fight. We don't want people to think that it's Arthur Scargill against Margaret Thatcher. It's Arthur Scargill against Ian McGregor and the Coal Board or whatever it is. And the government is trying as best it can to be an honest broker in this dispute. No one believed it. It was clearly a fight between the government and the National Union of Mine Workers. But I feel instinctively that it looks very similar, but it can't be as similar as it looks. I need you to help me.
Well, if we look at the leadership here, prime ministers probably come in two main types. There are warriors who present themselves as battling on behalf of their nation, and then there are healers who regard themselves as drawing together their societies. And Margaret Thatcher and Stanley Baldwin stand absolutely on opposite sides of that. They're almost the archetypes of Prime Minister as warrior and Prime Minister as healer. But they do, in lots of ways, run the strike in similar ways. So Margaret Thatcher, like Stanley Baldwin, puts an enormous emphasis on preparation. The government is going to be ready for this strike. It is going to have planned almost every aspect of strike management. It is, if possible, going to make sure it happens in the spring rather than in the autumn or in the winter. That's crucially important. Mrs. Thatcher also narrates the strike in a similar way to Stanley Baldwin as an assault on democracy. She wants to say this isn't actually about the future of the mining industry. It is about the rule of law. And she says it is an attempt to replace the rule of law with the rule of the mob. The difference perhaps actually lies in the nature of the strike itself, in that, firstly, the coal strikes of 26 and of 84 are about fundamentally different things. So the 26 strike is about wages and conditions, whereas the 84 strike is principally about closures. Now, in general, it is harder to arrange a national strike around closures because many workers are in pits that are not going to close, and to some extent the closure of unprofitable pits might actually be quite good for them. It might protect their employment chances in the short term. So we would normally expect it to be harder to generate a national strike on that basis. What pulls in the opposite direction, I think, is the sense of existentiality, that the argument in 26 is about the conditions under which miners will work. The argument in 84 is about whether there will be a mining industry at all. Because the mining industry has been in decline for so much of the 20th century, you're now reaching a point at which you can't close that many more pits and still actually have mining as a serious industry in the UK, as events prove. So in that respect, actually, the solidarity of 84 is almost stronger, perhaps, than in 26, because although not all miners are directly implicated in the closure programme, the whole culture and community of mining is implicated in the question of whether this survives into the 90s and beyond.
One difference is that in 1984, Thatcher's rhetoric included emphasising that Scargill had refused to call a ballot on this strike. And that was why it was undemocratic. He didn't even have the courage to ask his members whether they supported him, that he was effectively an unaccountable autocratic leader of the mining movement. And that was very important in the rhetorical struggle of that time. There was, I think, nothing comparable in 1926, was there, in the sense that the claim is that this is undemocratic, but it's undemocratic because of the act itself, not because the leaders of the union movement were acting without the support of their members.
It does feature in 1926. You're absolutely right that it's not the central issue in the way that Mrs. Thatcher makes it in 1984. But in the British Gazette, for example, it's a routine claim that these men have called out millions of workers without asking them, without asking whether they wish to do this. And that becomes part of the claim that this isn't about the loyalty of ordinary working people. In a sense, they are doing what they did in 1914 and 1915, which is coming out to fight when their generals call. But that the leadership is acting undemocratically and unconstitutionally. Interestingly, one of the unions that doesn't participate in 26 is the National Seamen's Union. And that is partly done by insisting that they must ballot their members and constantly postponing the ballot so that it never actually happens. So one of the reasons why government is able to manage the strike in 26 is that, in fact, ships are still moving. A lot of coastal trade is still happening. You've got the challenge of unloading it when it gets to the docks, but you're not actually stopping the movement of supplies on the high seas.
I think it's fair to say, and I was old enough to remember the end of the miners' strike in 1985. It didn't end in the same way as the general strike in 1926. It ended more like the end of the mining strike in 1926, which is a drift back to work, and then a final moment when it was clear that the miners had been defeated, but not that flagship moment of relief. I don't remember Margaret Thatcher driving to the House of Commons and people throwing their hats in the air. So it doesn't feel like an event that has that, whether it's cathartic or symbolic moment, which is the end of the 9 days of the general strike. And it's also not the case that 2 years after the miners were defeated, Neil Kinnock was elected prime minister. So it also doesn't have that arc to it, that it was an illusion, the victory. I don't think the victory was an illusion. It was a decisive defeat. The NUM was never the same again. Arthur Scargill was effectively broken as a political leader with ambitions to be able to bring down the government. Neil Kinnock survived the strike intact, but he lost in 87. He lost again in 92. But the Labour Party did return as a national party of government within just over a decade. And there is potentially, I think, at least a similar arc to this story, that something was purged which made it somewhat easier for the Labour Party to recast itself as a national party of government. The party that came back in 1997 did so having, among other things, very clearly distanced itself from radical trade unionism. So there, it's more of a stretch to see a parallel. But do you think there is a parallel in that absolutely totemic struggle in the middle of the 1980s, which could have broken the Labour Party, didn't? It broke the National Union of Mine Workers. But the Labour Party was fine, actually, not least because Neil Kinnock, I think, handled the strike quite skillfully.
I think one parallel, perhaps, actually, is with what happens to Margaret Thatcher's personal popularity in the year after the strike. That if you track through the polls, there's quite a high level of support, possibly reluctant, but nonetheless, for the idea that the government must win the strike. Once it does, Mrs. Thatcher's popularity drops significantly for, I think, the 9 months that follow. And I think it's partly, again, that sense that once the strike is defeated, it is much easier simply to express sympathy for the strikers, to wish that it had been resolved in some more peaceful way, that perhaps they could have got around a table and talked. And the sort of sense of triumphalism around Margaret Thatcher is harmful to her image. Although she's not a Stanley Baldwin, whose brand is about being a unifier, nonetheless, there is a sense of gloating over the corpses of your enemies that I think troubles many conservatives. Famously, the former Harold Macmillan, Lord Stockton, goes to the House of Lords during the strike and gives a speech in which he says the strike is a tragedy. These are the best men in the country. They beat the Kaiser's army. They beat Hitler's army. He wants the strike beaten, but he doesn't like the sense that the miners are being kind of driven into the ground. And I think that does feed into, as just one piece, a wider problem that the Conservative Party has by about 1990, which is that Margaret Thatcher's politics are all about drawing the sword against very powerful enemies. It's a politics of pugilism, in which you're defending the country from strikes, from socialism, and from the Soviet Union. And by 1990, actually, all of those enemies are in pretty poor shape. The Soviet Union is breaking up. The Labour Party is clearly moving away from socialism. And the strike threat does appear to have been broken. So we're back on that interesting paradox that defeating your enemies actually sometimes is what removes your central political purpose.
The thing that stands between Thatcher and her hubris, maybe, making the Conservative brand less appealing, and the eventual return of the Labour Party as a party of national government with a landslide in 1997, is an interlude which is quite Baldwin-like, which is John Major's government. Actually, what happened with the fall of Margaret Thatcher was not the return of the Labour Party. It was a return of a much more Baldwin-like style of Conservative government than Margaret Thatcher had embodied. I mean, in a way, John Major is the most Baldwin-like Prime Minister since Stanley Baldwin.
Although an interesting coda here around the Major government is that it is, of course, the Major government, not the Thatcher government, that really does shutter the coal industry in the 90s. And in particular, it closes much of the Nottinghamshire coalfield. And intriguingly, Margaret Thatcher is rather angry about that, because the Nottinghamshire miners have stayed at work during the 84-85 strike, and that has been crucial to the defeat of the strike. And Margaret Thatcher does feel there is a debt of honour that is owed to those people who stood on the right side of history in that great encounter. So actually, even Margaret Thatcher doesn't think that the future of mining is just an economic question. She also is approaching it with all this sort of tangle of ethical concerns around loyalty, around patriotism, and that the people who stood on the side of law and order in 1984 should not be being betrayed by a Conservative government 10 years later.
We are 100 years on, exactly to the week, the start of the general strike. The trade union movement is nothing like it was in the 1980s or even 1990s, never mind the 1920s. But we have a politics which is fractious and feels quite fragile, and there are forces on the rise, on the left as well as on the right. There's new radicalism in the air. The general strike itself feels like an idea from history. To me, it feels like an idea from history. I cannot imagine a British politician or a significant British public figure uttering the words in 2026, what we need is a general strike. And yet, do you think there's any aspect of our politics in which the spirit of that is present? Is the idea of the general strike present in our politics in any other form? That notion from 26 that the stakes are very high, this is going to have to be a sorting event in which people are going to have to pick a side, and that in the end, actually, it's going to be a test of endurance or of ability to stick the fight. Do you feel that anywhere in our politics? Are 1926 and 2026 at all comparable?
I think the key issue is always, what is the question to which a general strike is the answer? What can a general strike achieve that an election or a boycott or a mass protest or some more targeted kind of strike, like the fuel protests in 2001, can't achieve? Now, I actually don't think that necessarily means that the general strike is dead, but it does mean that the general strike is not going to look like what happened in 1926. We don't live in the world of 1926. The economy is much more fragmented. The trade union movement is much weaker. Economic power is often concentrated outside the country in places that conventional industrial action can't really reach. But what we might potentially see actually is something more like that older model of the general strike with which we started. The idea of the general strike as a kind of mobilization of the people in defense of popular government. If we look at what happened in Minnesota over the winter, with the protests against the ICE rates, that was often described as a general strike. It did involve days in which businesses closed their doors. The No Kings movement at the moment is trying to organise a no school, no work, no shopping campaign. And this isn't about paralysing the economy. It's not a strike in which Labour goes to war against capital. It's a kind of assertion of popular power. And we're more likely, I think, to get that kind of mobilisation against a political threat than we are to get a 1926-style mobilisation around an industrial issue. And in that respect, ironically, we might be closer to the world of William Benbow than we are to the world of A.J. Cook and Herbert Smith.
Yeah, I can't see Zach Polanski getting up and saying what we need is a general strike, but I can see him getting up and saying what we need is a debt jubilee. And as you said, actually, if you take the story far enough back, that's closer to the origins of this idea than Sorel-like syndicalism or the ideas of the general strike in the early 1920s. Actually, there's a deeper history which is more resonant today. And of course, there is one more thing to say, which we haven't really touched on here, which is when you think about what a general strike involves, what it would mean for all Labour to be withdrawn in the 1926 case, but also in the strikes of the 1970s and the 1980s. This did not, on the whole, include domestic labour, and it certainly didn't include unpaid domestic labour. There was another strand of this kind of politics, including coming out of European traditions of syndicalism, say in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s, where revolutionaries would say the real power of the general strike is if we include domestic labour. If you actually want to raise the stakes and bring a country to a halt, the people who do most of the work, who are women, and they do it unpaid, if they, and this is an idea that goes all the way back to the ancient world, if they were to down tools, that would really flush out where the power lies. And again, that doesn't feel completely remote from contemporary politics. In a way, that feels more connected to some aspects of politics in 2026 than the politics of 1926. Women played a role in the strike of 1926, but not a particularly central role, not in the leadership, not among the political class, not among the kind of workers who came out on strike. Most women were employed in domestic service, which was not unionized. In the politics of 2026, there is also an idea of a general strike, which is much more general. It probably wouldn't be phrased as a general strike. There are all sorts of labour that take place, all sorts of different kinds of labour that take place, which are unpaid, exploitative, and which, if withdrawn, would bring the country to a halt. And again, that doesn't feel to me that removed from some of the political rhetoric of now, and maybe not that removed from political rhetoric far earlier in this story, but it is quite a long way from 100 years ago.
Yes, the 1926 strike is usually told as an entirely male story. Now, that is not in fact wholly accurate, that you will find figures like Ellen Wilkinson, for example, driving across the country speaking to strike meetings. People like Margaret Bondfield, the first female cabinet minister, are involved in decision-making around the general strike. Strike breaking also actually involves large numbers of women, both in the volunteer movement, but also figures like Flora Drummond, or General Flora Drummond, as she describes herself, a former militant suffragette who by 1926 is running the League of Empire Loyalists and calls a great mass meeting of women to protest against the tyranny of the Trade Union Congress and a masculine union movement. Nonetheless, if you look at the pictures of the decision makers, if you look at the meetings that are taking place in Number 10, this is largely a movement led by men that assumes that what you are thinking about is male labour. And that's a reminder that actually even the most radical political movements are bounded by the political imaginations of their times. If there is to be a general strike today or in the future, it's going to have to engage with a vastly expanded labour force, but also a vastly expanded conception of what labour actually is, that doesn't simply take place in smoky factories, but takes place in the home and in the family.
Coming soon, we are picking up our series, Where Are We Going?, exploring some of the big questions about the future. And I'm going to be talking to the writer and journalist Sarah O'Connor about the future of work. Will there be any jobs left when AI has had its way? But before that, next time in our regular slot, as part of our film season, I'm talking to the writer and broadcaster Misha Glenny about The Third Man. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.